Martha Whitaker stood at the bay window, watching Spanish moss sway in the humid Savannah breeze. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the Victorian mansion's parlor, and she couldn't shake the feeling that some of those shadows moved independently of the light. "Isn't it perfect?" James called from the kitchen, his voice echoing through empty rooms that still smelled of old wood and somebody else's memories. "Everything we've worked for, right here." She pressed her palm against the cool glass, fighting the urge to pack their bags and drive back to Connecticut. The house was James's dream, had been since that first vacation to Savannah 15 years ago. He'd spent countless nights planning their retirement, scrolling through historic home listings, talking about garden parties and restoration projects. But standing here now, surrounded by 13-foot ceilings and elaborate crown molding that had witnessed over 170 years of history, Martha felt like an intruder. No, that wasn't quite right. She felt intruded upon. "Martha," James appeared in the doorway, still wearing his tool belt from unpacking. "You're awful quiet." She forced a smile, just taking it all in. The lie felt bitter on her tongue, but she couldn't bring herself to voice her concerns. Not when James's eyes sparkled with such joy. Not when he'd worked so hard to make this happen. A floorboard creaked upstairs, the distinct sound of weight shifting across old wood. James was standing right here, and they hadn't hired movers. "Did you hear that?" she asked. "Old houses settle, honey. That's part of their charm." Martha nodded, but her chest tightened. She'd grown up in an old house in Massachusetts. She knew the difference between settling sounds and footsteps. Just like she knew the difference between drafts and the cool breath she'd felt on her neck while unpacking their bedroom. The rational part of her mind, the part that had made her a successful accountant for 40 years, tried to impose logic on her unease. Historic homes had quirks. Savannah was different from Connecticut. They were just adjusting. But as the sun dipped lower and shadows deepened across their new home, and another part of her mind whispered that maybe some dreams should stay dreams, that maybe there was a reason this beautiful house, despite its prime location and reasonable price, had been on the market for 3 years before they bought it. Something crashed upstairs, the sound of shattering glass unmistakable. "Just a picture frame falling," James said quickly, but Martha noticed his hand trembling as he gripped the door frame. Standing there in the fading light, Martha realized their dream home felt more like a beautiful trap. But she'd rather die than tell James that their retirement plan, the one they'd saved for decades to achieve, filled her with inexplicable dread. Some dreams, she was beginning to suspect, came with a price too steep to calculate. The first week passed in a blur of unpacking boxes and arranging furniture. During the day, the house seemed almost normal, its high ceilings and original hardwood floors bathed in Georgia sunlight. But nights were different. The shadows seemed to breathe, and Martha couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was during one of her sleepless nights that she met Miss Eleanor, their next-door neighbor. The elderly woman was tending her roses by moonlight, claiming the heat made daylight gardening impossible. "You're in the old Thaddeus house," Miss Eleanor said, her pruning shears pausing mid-snip. She wouldn't meet Martha's eyes. "Do you know much about its history?" "Some things are better left in the past, dear." Miss Eleanor's shears resumed their work with unusual vigor. "But if you're having trouble sleeping, you might want to check the Historical Society's archives. Just don't go after dark." The next morning, Martha found herself in the Savannah Historical Society, poring over yellowed newspapers and property records. The house's history was fragmented, with conspicuous gaps in ownership records. One article from 1865 caught her eye, a story about Dr. William Thaddeus, who had converted the home into an emergency hospital during the Civil War's final months. The article praised his innovative surgical techniques, but noted that many patients had died under mysterious circumstances. A follow-up piece reported his own death in the house, ruled a suicide despite unusual circumstances. That evening, as Martha tried to share her discoveries with James, all the kitchen cabinets flew open simultaneously. The sound of wood slamming against wood echoed through the house like gunshots. James's face went pale. Must be the foundation settling. But his excuses were wearing thin. even to himself. That night, they both heard the footsteps overhead, heavy boots pacing back and forth in a room that should have been empty. The violence began 3 weeks after they moved in. James was in his workshop, restoring an antique dresser when the entire workbench overturned, pinning him against the wall. Martha found him there, shaken but alive, with bruises that looked suspiciously like handprints on his shoulders. 2 days later, Martha woke to find every mirror in the house covered in what looked like surgical diagrams, drawn in condensation that shouldn't have been possible in their climate-controlled home. The drawings vanished within hours, but their message was clear. They weren't alone. The final straw came during a thunderstorm that rattled the windows like artillery fire. Martha was in the basement, searching for a flashlight when she felt it, a presence so cold and hostile it stole the breath from her lungs. In the beam of her phone's light, she saw him, a tall figure in a blood-stained Civil War surgeon's uniform, his face a mask of calculated cruelty. Martha ran upstairs to find James, only to hear him crying out from the study. The entity had him pinned to the wall. Without thinking, Martha charged forward. "We're not your patients," she shouted, "and we're not leaving. This is our home now." The ghost turned, its form flickering like a corrupted image. Martha grabbed James's hand, squeezing it tight. 40 years of marriage had taught them one thing: they were strongest together. "Your time is over," James added, his voice finding its strength. "Your hospital is closed. Your patients are at peace." The entity lunged forward, but Martha stood her ground, understanding flooding through her. "But we're not afraid, not anymore, not together." The ghost's form began to dissolve, like ink in water. The temperature rose, degree by degree, until the basement felt like a basement again, not a tomb. They sold the house and learned to live with their decision to do so. Martha often thought about that final confrontation, about how facing their fears together had made them stronger. The house had taught them something valuable. Some dreams aren't what they seem, but a true partnership can weather any storm, supernatural or otherwise. When they finally found a new home, a charming bungalow near Forsyth Park, it came with its own quirks and creaks. But this time, they faced them together, knowing that the only ghosts they needed to fear were the ones they brought with them. In the end, Martha realized it wasn't about the house at all. It was about learning to trust not just your own instincts, but also the strength you find in facing your fears hand in hand with someone you love.